I'd like to welcome our very own Professor Danielle Citron to give our faculty closing.
Thank you so much, and Joella and all of you at JBLT. You guys did a great job. You brought all of my favorite people together, and I think we all learned a tremendous amount. So what I'm going to try to do is to go back over what we've learned. And so forgive me if some of the areas are not my sort of zone of expertise. But I think Travis started us off so beautifully, right, by characterizing network technologies or the internet as the sort of virtual public square. And we know, of course, that's not all that it is, right? It's not just a public square, it's where we make a living, it's where our sort of Google CVs are so that we can get jobs and establish our online reputations. It's where we socialize. It's so many things to all of us, right? But a crucial piece of it is so echoed by what so many of our wonderful speakers talked about, which is our ability to sort of actualize our own sets of dreams, right? The sort of autonomy justification of the First Amendment. The way in which we both speak and listen to decide the kind of world we want to live in, right? To govern ourselves, and to more generally sort of participate in democratic culture. And it also, of course, helps us sort of spread truths, and if they're not so true, right, to make a set of kind of questions about what's truthful so that the marketplace of ideas can work it out, right? And so I think all of those kind of core justifications of the First Amendment were a part of all of our discussions today. We saw that, so Tamara, I'm going to start with where you were, right? Like, we once thought of the First Amendment as the important tool of the disenfranchised, the ugly, the awful, right, the offensive, the neo-Nazi wanting to march in Skokie, right, the person who wants to crush animals, right, create videos. But I think increasingly, right, I love how you put it, this sort of corporate civil rights movement, right, we're seeing that increasingly it's the powerful, the enfranchised, right, corporate actors using the First Amendment in the way that the disenfranchised did. Now it's come certainly to as great sort of fuel for corporations. And we talked about how businesses can, of course, interfere with free expression, right? So Travis had us think about ISP and broadband providers that, if allowed to so charge for access to the internet, would really disenfranchise lots of people, right? So Neil, I'm thinking of notions of corporations, right, collecting so much data about us and ever surveilling us, and frankly sharing it with the NSA and government, so that impeding self-expression is the sort of structural collection of all this data in ways that are really chilling. And Wendy, you talked about how businesses can harass and impede the self-expression of individuals, right, because they dare to do incredibly important research, right, that would be against corporate interests, and so therefore chilling important speech. We also talked about how government regulation or agencies, right, can impede free expression or an expression of corporate interest. So Jane, you talked about the Federal Trade Commission Act, right, and enforcement of regulations impeding what might be truth-seeking speech about eggs, right, or much more broadly speaking, about scientific claims that might indeed need further breathing room, right? And we talked about how the Federal Drug Cosmetics Act may indeed be impairing like medical devices that in fact or may be speech, right? And we talked about how, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about how, I'm going to sweep back to what we learned about the question of corporate speech. Is it an absolute, right? Or does it admit some balancing and sort of sets of concerns about antitrust? And we talked about for the anti-solicitation laws, right? So government rules impeding expression, important expression, and Renee talked about that. We talked a little bit, so Glenn's not here from Microsoft, but I think he really he did a beautiful job explaining to us the kinds of thoughtful decisions that corporate platforms, intermediaries engage in thinking about ways in which private actors can chill the expression of other private actors, right, in these gaming communities. So what I thought I would do, James, where's James Scribbleman, my wonderful colleague? Okay, so James said to me, Danielle, I want you to talk about your book. And I thought, no, Joella asked me to sum up, right? So now I get to talk a little bit about my work. So I'm going to tell us a nice segue from Glenn's talk about corporate actors sort of in their role as, or imbuing sort of ethical values, right? They're not bound by the First Amendment, but they certainly want to protect the speech interests of other private actors or gamers. I'm thinking of Anita Sarkeesian, right? So Anita Sarkeesian is a journalist who has explored lots of issues about gaming and sexism in gaming. And about 2 years ago, she announced on Kickstarter that she was generating a campaign to make a documentary about sexism in video games. And about a week after she announces that she's making this documentary series, a cyber mob descends. And so on her Twitter feed, as well as in her email inbox, that wasn't known to many in the public, she received graphic rape threats and death threats, including her home address. And what popped up online was a game called Beat Up Anita Sarkeesian. So when you can find it now on Google, right? You click on the game, and there's Anita's very distinct. She's a very distinguished looking woman, and you see, all you have to do is press a key, and her face gets increasingly bloodied and purple. Kickstarter started to receive hundreds of false complaints that her campaign to raise money for this documentary series was fraudulent, right? And her YouTube channel, Facebook page, and Twitter account received, this is the irony, right? Her pages were, or her platforms were reported as hate speech, spam, and terrorism. Now, Anita's really well known, and so the platforms came to her and said, you know, you've been falsely reported hundreds of times. We're not going to kick you off of YouTube. We know who you are, right? But the idea was to silence her. We were going to silence her as well with distributed denial of service attacks. So she's a website called Feminist Frequency, where she uploads lots of her videos and conversations. And it was hit with DDoS attacks on a regular basis. So she was constantly being sort of knocked offline, right? So we're seeing private actors coming together, not only using rape threats, right, false reports, but also the brute force of technology to shove her offline, right? Now, what we see is companies like Microsoft, and more recently, sort of and gratifyingly, companies like Twitter and Reddit and Facebook coming out and in a very clear manner explaining their terms of service and community guidelines forbid threats, forbid certain kinds of harassment, including the posting of nude photos, right? And we're seeing companies, and they're able to do that, they're private actors, right, making very clear that the norms on their site, which it's their sort of decision to make, is that they don't tolerate silencing speech, right? And I think even most recently, the EFF put up a post about online harassment in which, and I always find this like such a soaring moment, when the EFF says, online harassment is silencing speech. It silences other people's speech. I always think for a civil liberties organization to come out and say that is like, oh, my heart is like, I'm swelling. I don't have to do with myself. But I think it's an important recognition, right, that harassing speech can be silencing to victims in the same way in which, Wendy, you talked about, you know, we can try to silence and harass people into being quiet, not talking about their research or scientific research in ways that has a really adverse impact on public health, right? We certainly see that when we chase people offline simply because they dare to talk about sexism in video games, right? And what else did the cyber mob know about Anita Sarkeesian but that, right? To silence her, to tell her to be quiet, and to scare her, right? And most recently, she had to cancel a talk at Utah State University because sort of the week before, she was scheduled to give a talk, and the dean's office received anonymous phone calls and emails that suggested that if Anita Sarkeesian came and spoke at your school, that there would be a school shooting worse than Newtown and Columbine combined, right? So Anita says to the dean's office, well, what do I do? She said, look, if you get a police presence, I'll come, right? And the response from the Utah State Police was, we can't help you there because we have concealed carry laws, right? We can't check people for guns. So my question is, would they say that to President Obama? Like, we're not going to check for guns? Come on, seriously? Are we just simply trivializing online abuse? But what I think we're seeing is corporate actors endeavoring, right, to protect the speech interests, the work opportunities, professional reputations of individuals, right? And really importantly, though, and this is, I think, has to be a concomitant obligation by companies, is to explain when they ban threats, non-consensual pornography, harassment, and stalking, what they mean by those terms, and how victims ought to report, and what happens when speech is deemed violative of terms of service, right? Being transparent and clear about what they mean, and giving users, if their speech is removed, or if their privileges are suspended, a chance to respond. And I know that's something that Xbox Live is constantly worrying about, that they give their users a chance to explain themselves, right? So that their speech isn't deprived without their say-so. So that, I will end on that note. But it's sort of hopeful, right? Like, I a little bit frightened us, but then said, look, businesses are stepping in to help. There's law. We could talk about that later if anyone wants to talk to me. And I think we all can so protect it. So thank you so much. Today was terrific. I think we all learned a tremendous amount. So thank you guys. Did great.